Assembly of First Nations Chiefs voted unanimously today to call for the government to cancel that pipeline deal with Alberta. When asked about this vote, Energy Minister Tim Hodgson pointed to the current economic stakes.
Canadians expect us to deal with this hinge moment. We need to respond. Our economy is under attack. Our best cards, none of us want to be in a situation where we are told we have no cards. We have great cards in our energy and natural resources. We need to play them effectively. We need to work together. Now is not the time to split apart. Now is the time to come together and figure out how we can develop our energy and our natural resources.
For more on this, British Columbia Assembly of First Nations Regional Chief Terry Teegee joins me now. Nice to see you, sir. Thanks for coming in.
Nice to be here.
So you got a question to the Prime Minister I saw this afternoon. You asked him about this pipeline deal, the MOU with Alberta. Were you satisfied with the answer you got from him?
Certainly not. You know, he didn't answer the full question, but certainly he did commit to meeting with coastal First Nations. And I think, moreover, I certainly hope that he meets with all of British Columbia First Nations and discuss this MOU that he has with Alberta, and also further to that is to gain the trust with First Nations, because right now, as you've seen with the previous guest, you know, there's a lot of mistrust right here. There are a lot of people feel deceived about you know, some of the political maneuvers by this government in terms of getting an MOU with Alberta. Would we have, you know, would the budget have passed if this MOU was ahead of time? And certainly Elizabeth May and perhaps other parliamentarians feel deceived, and I think we'd be in election right now.
Yeah, I want to, obviously the AFN passed this motion unanimously today asking the federal government to take a step back from the Alberta MOU. I want you to comment on that, but I also want you to comment on what we're hearing from Liberal MPs as well on this deal, because as you know, the proponent, Alberta, has to get some consent from First Nations people if they want to build this pipeline. But the MOU doesn't actually use that word. It says that Alberta and Canada recognize their obligations to consult with and, where appropriate, accommodate Indigenous peoples. But there's nothing about consent in that MOU. I mean, that's been bandied about by some of the Liberal MPs since then, but that's not actually in the written text of the agreement with the province. Does that concern you? Are you worried that it's consult, not consent?
Yeah, certainly. I think many First Nations are worried about, you know, the language used in the MOU. I think in regards to the resolutions that was passed this morning to reaffirm tanker moratorium in the Northwest Coast, was resoundingly supported, 97% of all those in attendance and chiefs. So what that tells me is that there are many First Nations across this country are really supportive of our point of view. And I think they're worried about with their own territories that this would set a precedent. So that's very, very worrying. And I think in terms of the MOU, not merely consult. In British Columbia, we do have the United Nations Declaration of Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act, which is a provincial and federal law, United Nations Declaration Act, which is law. And as far as we're concerned, it's free, prior, and informed consent. And that's really important. It's not merely consultation. And certainly many First Nations in British Columbia will uphold that and the provisions to make decisions as a part of our sovereignty and self-determination.
Chief, you know, obviously the coastal First Nations are diametrically opposed. That is well understood. But there are also some Indigenous communities, Métis and First Nations, who are interested in potentially being equity owners in a pipeline like this if it ever goes ahead. How do you balance those two camps? How do you represent people who are diametrically opposed? But there's also, I'm sure, some folks up in that region who might want to take an ownership stake in this and maybe see some of the economic benefits that could come from it.
Well, I think bearing brunt of the risk, you know, going through British Columbia, I mean, the MOU totally excluded British Columbia. I think not only are British Columbia First Nations worried about this whole process with this MOU, I think British Columbians in of itself are worried about what is happening here without any discussions with British Columbians, and we take the brunt of the risk. We've been down this road 20 years ago with Enbridge Northern Gateway Pipeline, and it was rejected in November of 2016. And I think, you know, going back to many of those communities, many of those nations, many of those chiefs they're saying the same thing, that there will be no pipeline, especially one to the northwest coast. And that's in British Columbia. I certainly know that there are other communities and chiefs that are supportive of looking at potentially a pipeline in Alberta, and certainly that's, their prerogative. It's up to them. But if it's going through our respective territories, I think many First Nations in BC will uphold their ability to decide on what is occurring in their territories.
All right, let's leave it there. Nice to see you. BC Regional Chief Terry Teegee, thanks for coming in, sir.
Thank you.
Prime Minister Mark Carney addressed the Assembly of First Nations just hours ago. This comes in the wake of Carney announcing his energy agreement with Alberta last week, a deal which received pushback from some First Nations. Today, Carney offered assurances about the consultation process that will be required for nation-building projects.
Under the legislation, there must be consultation consistent with free, prior and informed consent before a project can be designated in Canada's national interest, and none have been so far. But even once one is designated, even once that happens, there must be additional consultations on the conditions necessary for that project to succeed.
Stephen Buffalo is the President and CEO of the Indian Resource Council of Canada, and he joins me now. Nice to see you, sir. Thanks for coming in.
Thanks for having me.
So what do you make of this decision by, I guess, virtually all of the chiefs at the AFN today to oppose the MOU between Canada and Alberta?
Well, it was quite interesting how I witnessed today, and I was rather appalled on how they passed this resolution. And I know some of our members, some of our Indian Resource Council members, some of the chiefs from Alberta and Saskatchewan weren't present in the room. And I didn't see a vote, and all there was asked for is an objection. And there's being none, they just passed it. So does it represent the true that all First Nations are against some of the aspects of the MOU? I don't think so. But I will say this, there's not a chief in there that is taking the environmental concerns very serious. But, seeking a balance between protecting the environment and seeking economic development, I think that's something we all should strive for.
Why do you support this MOU?
Well, the MOU really outlines an opportunity, and within the MOU, it does acknowledge and recognize Aboriginal treaty rights, which I'm sure includes the United Nations Declaration Rights of Indigenous People. So there's opportunity that there's a document in today's present day that First Nations are going to be a part of it. So, with the energy sector, the natural resource sector, I think that's the way that First Nations can address their poverty issues, their social issues, because there's not a chief in Canada that isn't dealing that with right now. We have bad water, boil water advisories all over Canada. And what we're looking for is ways to make our own, create our own wealth to address needs of our communities.
Yeah, because it could be quite lucrative for a number of First Nations communities if this pipeline is built, right? There's the potential for an equity stake. You know all about loan guarantees, of course, with your other hat that you wear. I mean, there's a potential for an ownership stake, jobs, wealth creation. That's something that you're pushing, right?
Oh, for sure. Like the natural resource sector is probably the largest employer of First Nations. A lot of the communities that I work with in Alberta and Saskatchewan, they have partnerships with industry. And I'll say this about industry, they've made some great strides, leaps and bounds to really bridge that relationship with First Nations so the economy can still be good. When First Nations do well, the municipality does well, and then the province does well.
Yeah, I didn't actually realize that Canada's oil and gas industry is actually one of, if not the largest employers of Indigenous peoples. It's a major source of employment for folks that you represent.
And we're still building our capacities. We're working with regulators, and we're adding traditional knowledge in a lot of key areas. And I think, the infrastructure that we're talking about here is the safest way to move the product. And the one thing we kind of overlook is its access to world markets. The national chief said in his speech this morning, Trump tariffs are impacting us. And if we do not have a pipeline going to world markets, we're feeding that Trump monster, to that capacity. We're selling our oil to the United States at a huge discount. And, and to me, that really hurts. And then she also mentioned the GDP. And what's going to happen if we don't do this pipeline and we block it? The GDP is going to go down, and of course impact the First Nations community and people. It's going to be more severe than anything.
Yeah, I mean, I've seen some estimates that the pipeline could contribute $25 billion to the GDP, $5 billion in taxes and royalties, some of them obviously going to First Nations governments as well. Quite lucrative. What do you say to, obviously it's the coastal First Nations in BC who are diametrically opposed. They do not want a pipeline. They don't want the tanker moratorium to be lifted. They don't want to see this product move to markets in Asia. What do you say to those chiefs who are standing in the way of this project potentially getting built?
Well, I hope at some point that we can all sit down and through our cultures, we have ceremonies that we can build that relationship without government and without industry. For the most part, again, it's just one infrastructure project that would be very considerable, helpful to the First Nations all across this country. I look at it from all aspects. Federal equalization. If Alberta can't make its transfer payment, there's a small portion in that transfer payment that addresses the First Nations under the Indian Act and its funding agreements. And we're seeing in the federal budget that it's going to be considerably less. So, the nation building projects are very important. And if we were to sit down with the First Nations along the coast and outline some of the social impacts that we're dealing with today. In fact, you look at Premier Rob Canoe, he's going through, he's implemented a plan to search the waste fields for Indigenous women. Like, that's socialism that's killing us. And I just hope that we can share stories. They can teach us about the ocean. They can teach us about their concerns, and we can teach them about some of the things that we dealt with in the oil and gas sector, and talk about pipelines and stuff that we know. So I'm just hoping that we can find a happy place.
You think they're open to something like that, sitting down with you? Have you tried that?
I haven't tried it yet, but I know right now our provincial government in Alberta, Danielle Smith, she's trying to make her leadership team try to reach out and have some good relationship discussions. Consultation is a term that we use in the court of law, but at the end of the day, it's relationship building. And right now, there's not a First Nation in Canada that isn't impacted by social problems. So these projects where we can make our own revenue, create our own wealth, I think are very important for all of us.
All right, let's leave it there. Stephen Buffalo, President and CEO of the Indian Resource Council of Canada. Really nice to see you, sir. Thanks for coming in.
Thank you.
Time for the Power Panel. Emily Nicolas is a columnist for Le Devoir. Supriya Dwivedi was an advisor to former Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. Lisa Ray is a former Conservative cabinet minister, and Cheryl Oates was the director of communications for former Alberta NDP Premier Rachel Notley. Nice to see you all. Thanks for coming on. Supriya, I'll start with you. Did you get to catch any of the Prime Minister's address to the AFN? It seems like he got a relatively warm reception from the crowd, although it wasn't overly warm, but it wasn't exactly hostile either. But he was welcomed to the stage with a unanimous vote by all the chiefs there to oppose the MOU with Alberta. What do you make of how this AFN appearance went for the Prime Minister today?
I mean, given that it could have been terrible, I think it went exceptionally well, right? Like, the Prime Minister was walking into a situation where it very well could have gone off the rails, and it didn't. And I think the Prime Minister stuck in that speech there a few key lines that I think it should at least provide some solace to folks. And I think it's good for the Prime Minister, as well as Minister Hodgson, to be saying out loud and in plain language that we need a level of consultation that can be considered in line with FPIC, or free and prior informed consent. But the problem is that I'm not sure the text of the Building Act necessarily reflects that, and certainly the text of the MOU does not reflect that. And if you consider the fact that there are several First Nations in Ontario right now that have already filed a legal challenge on the basis that the Building Canada Act doesn't actually have a legal requirement for that FPIC that I referred to, as well as other reasons, among UNDRIP references being non-binding and unenforceable. This is a bit of a comms kind and policy issue for the government to fully explain what the MOU does and doesn't mean, and what the level of engagement is actually required. Because right now, the biggest takeaway from the MOU isn't actually the agreement itself, but basically what both sides have concluded it means. And for the federal government, what it actually means depends on who you're talking to on any given day. And that's an issue. Like, the Liberals would be better off echoing the language used by Premier Smith when talking about the MOU. And I think, quite frankly, a Liberal talking point, something along the lines of, yeah, we're prioritizing the economy because that's what's best for the country, instead of this muddled messaging of trying to be all things to all people, would probably sit better.
Yeah, Lisa, to that point, I mean, the Liberal position on this really does seem to be shifting, and it depends on who you speak to, because when you actually look at the text of the MOU as it relates to Indigenous peoples, it says Alberta and Canada recognize their obligations to consult with and, where appropriate, accommodate Indigenous peoples. And then you have someone like Liberal MP Tlaib Noor Mohammed, you might have seen this, who was tweeting recently saying that any project that goes through the Major Projects Office must have BC and First Nations consent. So, I mean, there's a difference between what's in the actual legal agreement that the Prime Minister signed with the Premier and what some of the Liberals are saying on social media and to cameras on Parliament Hill.
You mean there's spin going on, JP? No, really?
I'm shocked. I'm clutching
shocked.
my pearls.
Horribly shocked. I would say that here's my observation. First of all, they could take the advice of Supriya, which I think is really good advice. Secondly, in the past, we've gotten from the Liberal government a lot of, I would say, more comms heavy kind of announcements where they were trying to put forward a project based upon communications, but really didn't have the deal to back it up. This time they've got hard paper. They got a transaction in the form of an MOU. And as a result, they are kind of on the back foot of communicating what it is. All this to say, it leaves a vacuum of other people interpreting or maybe trying to say what they hope it is. But what will matter is, how does it get implemented? And that isn't going to get tested until there's an actual deal on the table. So until then, we're all just kind of wondering what could possibly happen and watching other people's reactions to it. But there will be a time that this will be tested. And I'm hoping that all the parties that are involved are going to see that the outcome that we need to get is a way in order to grow revenues in this country, because the threat we have to our economy is real and it's pressuring and it's here.
Cheryl?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think we heard anything different today than we have heard over the past few days. The Prime Minister has really chosen his position in this whole transaction and the whole discourse around it to say, we have made a deal with Alberta that paves the way for essentially the whole process to start. And he has said, if a project were to go ahead, it needs, well, sometimes he says this, sometimes he telegraphs this, it needs buy-in from BC, it needs buy-in from First Nations, or at least consultation with First Nations. And that part is up to Danielle Smith. It's up to the government of Alberta, and it's up to the proponent of whatever this future project might look like. And he sort of said, like, that's not up to the federal government. This is now Alberta's problem, or Alberta's path to solve it. And really, this, like so many have said, this is really difficult to decide what this looks like and what meaningful consultation would look like, because we don't have a project yet. We don't have a route yet. We don't have a proponent yet. And so who's affected, how they're affected, and what they, might entice them to come to the table are all big question marks. I think the real big takeaway from this is the fact that none of these nations on the coast, the coastal First Nations, were talked to before Alberta said, we want to build a pipeline through your nations, or that affect your nations. And that's why we're in a position where you have people speaking out against a project that doesn't exist yet.
And I think it's important to point out, too, the legal ramifications of this, because we've been down this road before with Trans Mountain, right, Emily? I mean, there was a number of challenges, one from BC. First Nations also opposed the federal approval of this pipeline. And ultimately, the court decided that First Nations have to be consulted, but they don't actually have an outright veto over a project like this. But that is not an easy political sell for some of the Liberal Party base, right? And it's going to be tricky for the Prime Minister to navigate that, because, yeah, he might have the law on his side. If they really want this pipeline, they can push ahead with it. They can do some consultation. It could be over a couple of years. It might be sufficient, but they might not actually get agreement and consent. How do you think they navigate what is really a tricky situation moving forward?
It's not, first of all, surprising that sometimes the rule of law in Canada is not on the side of Indigenous rights. That's how the country was built. And so that law sometimes is ever evolving. And it's also the trick. So there's the duty to consent of the federal government, or the government said, or the private companies that might push forward the project. But there's also the consultation of whom. It's been an issue with several projects in the past, whether it's just essentially the council and the people who are represented as chief or part of the Assembly of First Nation, or if it's also a hereditary chief and the people in the communities themselves who have sometimes a different worldview and understanding of Indigenous sovereignty that people who operate within the Indian Act. And so all of that is very political, depends on nation to nation. And what you have right now is a prime minister who is essentially saying, I want to remove obstacles to moving projects at a further pace because I want to speed things along. And he's removing some of it that is bureaucracy, but he also, with C5, essentially is saying two things. First, I want to consult with First Nations and respect First Nations, and also I want things to move faster, and I'm drafting a project without the input a lot of Indigenous peoples. And so you have the mess that is today, where the C5 itself is already being challenged in court. And you have now this MOU, which basically operates on the same thing, where you have the Prime Minister going to the Assembly of First Nations saying, I want to respect everybody, and at the same time only talks to Alberta while making a decision. And so there's a disconnect between what he's doing and what he's saying. Sometimes it's creating chaos, and it's creating chaos within his own caucus. And that is there's a lot of lessons there to be learned for him, I think, as a new prime minister. But I also think we're living in the last couple of months, basically a concentration of basically what Canada was built on, and why it's such a challenge to be built on native land, and the way in which it keeps popping back up. Even though it's a bad week for Thomas King, but just saying it's always the inconvenient truth that comes back to haunt us all the time.
Yeah. And to Lisa's point, I mean, we should really believe what's in writing, perhaps. Although a lot is being said in the hallways on Parliament Hill, it's really what they've agreed to and what there's a signature. And what he said today, I think, is also informative. He said there must be consultation. He did not talk about a veto or even consent. So Priya, I want to ask you about some of the polling that we've seen on this MOU to this point, because there has already been some polling. They work pretty quickly. Angus Reid has one out. This was mostly conducted after the MOU was signed last week. And it shows that the Liberals are picking up support in Alberta and Saskatchewan, but they are seeing some sliding in BC. Actually, they've lost 5 points in less than a month in British Columbia. Do you think that there is a huge political liability to something like this, or is this something that will just blow over?
No, I mean, I think there's definitely political risk in this. I wouldn't, and this isn't a shot at any of the polling firms that are currently in the field over this, but I don't think that political opinion will have solidified for quite some time. I mean, all we've been hearing for the last, 6-ish months is basically how we need to prioritize the economy in the face of the uncertainty that we're facing because of Donald Trump's trade war, and we need to shore up our trading partners so that we're not overly reliant on just the one giant to our south, et cetera, et cetera. But we haven't actually started to see a sustained campaign from, folks on the BC coast, including coastal First Nations, including folks that are, see the Great Bear Rainforest as like Canadiana sort of identity, right? And I mean, once you start getting some of those messages into the larger public discourse over this, that's when I think we'll start to see some of that polling kind of level out and give us a better indication of where political opinion really is. But I mean, I don't think the Carney folks went forward with this thinking it was going to be risk-free, but I just think that they likely thought, given everything that they've said during the election and then, immediately after, about needing to get things built and needing to get major projects along and cutting red tape and ensuring that, we are an energy powerhouse, or whatever the exact wording that the prime minister had used at the time, superpower. There we go. Sorry. Yeah. Is in line with that. Right. So, I mean, that just goes back to my first point. I think they should own it. I think they should just say that they're prioritizing the economy because he's an economist prime minister. So that's what they're doing.
Lisa, what's the best way to sell this MOU? Is it to lean in on the potential to diversify our markets? We take a step back from the U.S., we sell more to Asia. Is it playing up that this could potentially solve some of the national unity concerns? I mean, he smoothed over the relationship with Alberta. What do you think is the best way for him to pitch this deal to Canadians and people who are a bit skeptical about it?
I don't know if he needs to pitch the MOU. It's an agreement between the national government and a subnational government as to how they're going to go ahead and deal with some federal regulations that may be impeding some production of oil and gas or some projects in the province of Alberta. Again, it only really becomes relevant when the government is asked to start lessening the powers of these regulations, and that's many, many years away. So I can understand why the government just kind of wants to get it out there and get it over with and move on to the next thing. This really does not matter, quite frankly, until you have a project on the books. And Danielle Smith is going to have her advisory group to try to find a project that she can put in the window and test the MOU. But until then, I don't think the federal government needs to do anything other than to say, we're clearing the way to have these projects be proposed. It's now time for the private sector to say what they're going to do or not going to do, but we have other things we have to deal with as well in diversification, and it's this, and then move on.
Cheryl, I was struck by the numbers that we're seeing in this Angus Reid poll about Alberta. I mentioned there was a bit of an uptick in the support for the Liberal Party, but also for Carney personally. 45% now of Albertans support strongly or moderately of Carney, approve of the job that he's doing. I mean, that's pretty good. It's certainly better than what Trudeau had. And we're seeing actually similar numbers in Saskatchewan. But is that something that can actually translate into political success? I mean, do you actually think that there is something to be won politically for this government by going ahead with an MOU like this?
I do think there's something to be won, but I don't think it's necessarily in the success of a pipeline project. Mark Carney was in Calgary following the announcement of this deal, and I attended his chamber event, and I will say I was very surprised by the very positive reception that he got in the Calgary Chamber, which is a business community that is not generous with its applause. It gave the Prime Minister 2 standing ovations, and that is with the understanding that a pipeline project, an actual pipeline built to Tidewater, is not guaranteed. But what the room was applauding was the fact that Alberta had pushed back against a whole bunch of regulations through Danielle Smith, through her predecessors, through even the NDP government before that, and Alberta had been begging for years and years and through different political stripes to be taken seriously by Ottawa and to be listened to. And it felt like in that room, when the Prime Minister came to Calgary, that the room was saying thank you for finally listening to us. And I know there are parts of Canada that will cringe when they hear that, but that is certainly the sentiment in Alberta, that Ottawa doesn't pay attention or give Alberta credit for its contributions to the country's GDP or the country's economic success. And it felt like in that room that there was something to be gained for the Prime Minister and the business community, and maybe something broader in Alberta saying thank you for finally listening to us. And if that is sustained, I think that could translate into some electoral success for the Liberals.
Émilie, final word to you on this one.
It's hard for the Liberals to try to find a pathway to success through seats in Alberta and Saskatchewan. Let's put it this way. So we'll see what it can translate over there. It certainly is a political risk in BC. And the round of communication that Stephen Gibbons just did on Tout le monde en parle and on Patrice Roy, on the French side of Radio-Canada and other shows as well, definitely didn't help with Quebec, which is the province that voted the least for Pierre Poilievre and is in good part responsible for the Liberal victory. And so it's a very risky political calculus that the Prime Minister is doing, let alone the actual ethical and political issues that are there as well. So we'll see what happens next.